We tell stories. And yet very often, I find that when we're talking about Christianity, we don't tell stories. That's not always true. Very often we tell our testimony, which is very powerful. We tell the story of Jesus. But even those can be hindered, I think, and hampered. So in our testimonies, we'll say things like, oh, Jesus saved me from my sin. Well, is that a compelling story? I'm not sure that it is, because it's not detailed enough. What was your sin? Dive into it, go into the muck. People will associate with your humanity in that. And I think we do the same thing with the Bible a lot of the time. And I think partly it's because the Bible looks like this sort of ragtag collection of other books, just sort of cobbled together and pieced together, and there's no sort of flow, no narrative to it. And I don't think that's the case, actually. I think it has a very clear through line, because the authors who write those books, they're very aware that they're part of a story. They're very aware that they're part of God's big story. That he starts with one thing and it moves in a linear fashion towards something else. And actually we go from creation all the way through to, well, wherever you want to go to, really. We don't really know the end. Like, we don't know what's going to happen forever into eternity. In fact, this is God we're talking about. There is no end to the story. But the authors of the Bible are very aware that they are part of this story. They are in it. And what I want to do through this course, through Incarnation, is to make us aware of those kind of ideas. To make us aware of how narrative works in spirituality. How narrative works in one particular theme running through the Bible. And I've picked one theme because if I tried to do a whole swathe, we'd all get completely lost and it would be a mess. So the theme I've picked is creation and new creation. And what I want to look at is the ways in which the authors treat these themes and how we work through it from the original creation in Genesis. So tonight we're going to be looking at Genesis 1, through to the collapse of that creation, Adam and Eve, how they fall, through things like the Exodus, through the temple, and ultimately we'll get to Jesus, and how Jesus enacts a new creation, and how he redeems things that go wrong in the old creation. And what my hope really is, that I have several hopes for these weeks. The first hope is that, and this is the biggest hope, that we'll have a deep encounter with God. That we will discover things about him and the ways he works through our history. Because this is our story, right? If we're Christians, this is our story that we step into. We need to understand it. If this is our story, we need to know it really well. And we need to know how to live within it and how to enact it in our worlds. And this is part of what I mean by this word incarnation. Helen, if you could put my screen on, that'd be great. Because when we talk about incarnation, we talk primarily about Jesus coming into the world. And obviously that is what incarnation primarily means. But I also want to use this word to mean, how do we incarnate ourselves within this Christian story? How do we place ourselves within it? And how do we take this story into our worlds? Because we are in a story. Like, you might not feel like it. You might feel like your life is an accident, or that your life drifts from one thing to another. But that is never actually the case. Shakespeare said that the world is a stage, and we're all actors on that stage. And we need to realize that and be deliberate about the ways that we act upon that stage. And we've chosen our stage if we're Christians. We've chosen a stage filled with amazing people and an amazing God who is the director and gives us a script that we can ad-lib. How are we going to ad-lib that script really well? So I think that covers most of what I want to say at the start. What I hope is that you will have a deep encounter with God, and that you will discover ways of reading the Bible that are really cohesive and that have a flow and a narrative to them. And you'll discover some amazing new things about the ways in which people in the Bible incarnate themselves within the story and work to affect the story. So let's just go through a few practical things before we dive in. So we're going to run the course over 6 weeks. Each week will be similar in terms of structure. We're going to be having one teaching session. Now, this teaching session was originally going to be a more interactive, discussion-based group thing, and then you lot turned up. I was planning to do this with like a dozen people, and then I got this. So I can't do the amount of interaction that I originally intended, but if you have a question, stick your hand up and we'll interact, and we'll see what we can do in conversation to an extent. But please appreciate that the amount of people that there are, and also the amount of material that we have to get through in the 6 weeks, we have to stay on track a little bit. We can't just dive off on tangents. So while I know that some of you will be external processors and you want to question things, great, please do that. But I might pull it back at some point. So we'll have 2 sessions in each week. So we'll have one sort of teaching session, then we'll have a drinks break, so you can get up, move around, stretch your legs, talk, have a bit of a chat with people, maybe mull over what you've heard already. And then the second section, and we'll have some sort of worship or ministry time at the end to sort of help you work through what's happened. And my hope is that this material will change the way that you live, which is quite a big aim, right? I decided to be ambitious, but I don't expect that to happen immediately. I think that this stuff will start to ripple out over the next few months and even years of your life, maybe even the rest of your life. And I make no apologies for how academic or intellectual this is going to be. I'm not going to fill it with jargon. I'm not going to make it so high level and so ununderstandable that you're just completely lost. But there will be some tricky stuff to understand. And at times I will rattle through at a pace. So to help with that, Philip has kindly agreed to film it so that we can catch up on it later. So we can, I missed that, what on earth did he say there? And you can watch it another dozen times and realise you still didn't know what I said. In which case, email me. So it is academic and it is intellectual, but it's also spiritual. Because we're talking about Christianity and theology here. And what you get in a lot of secular universities is, I was going to say a reluctance, but actually they don't really allow you to have a spiritual side to that teaching. You just teach on a secular level about theology. And I kind of don't understand how that can work. I don't understand how you can talk about theology without having an interaction with God as part of that. And so we're going to be having times of ministry and worship as a response to the academia, if you like. What else did I want to cover? Oh, out of interest actually, how many people here, I don't know how to ask this really, how many people here have done a degree in the past, in any subject? Okay, so a fair number. How many haven't, if you're okay putting your hand up for that? Again, a fair number, right? So if you're feeling lost by the academic sort of language and stuff, you're not on your own. There are people around you who might be struggling a bit as well. But actually, I suspect you might be surprised at how much you can take on board. Challenge yourself. I can do this. I can do this. And trust me, other people will be lost as well. The people who've done degrees, they'll be lost by bits of it because it'll rattle through. And like I say, it'll ripple out over a long period of time. We're in collaboration and in conversation with God. So if you are feeling lost, I don't think it's necessarily that you're not intellectual enough. Maybe you're just not spiritual enough. Okay, yeah, so a fair number of you signed up gave me your email address, so a few of you will have had, those people who did sign up will have had an email from me earlier this week. Please say you did. Excellent, that's really good news. So on those emails, so this week I just asked you to read Genesis 1 and gave you a few sort of preliminary questions to sort of help you start to think about some of the themes. If you want to get emails on a weekly basis, it will just be read a chapter of the Bible and think about this. It's not going to be too heavy. If you want that, the sign-up sheet is over there. And if you want to take notes, we've got paper and pens. Where are the paper and pens? There's pens at the back, and I think I've left the paper on a chair down in the lobby. Thanks, Helen. And I think that's about it. Yeah, that's it. So I'd like us to start with a song of worship. Oh no, Helen's doing that. Right. Okay, so on... Oh, thanks, Naomi. This is going really well. Yeah, so we're going to start with a song of worship so that we can get God on our minds and sort of start to focus on Him, and also to stretch your legs to get into that moment. And I've chosen a song that's explicitly about Jesus, because I'm not actually going to talk about Jesus until week 4. So I wanted to sing about and to Him immediately, because I know that might make some people uncomfortable, but I'm working through the Bible sort of chronologically, and Jesus doesn't come in until quite late on. So He's a big part of it, but He's quite late. So Helen, if we could have that song, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Shall we pray before we start? Would someone like to pray for us? I don't want to be doing all the talking. Would someone be willing to do that? Don't all leap forward at once. Penny, brilliant, thank you.
We just thank you for this time together tonight. Thank you for Dave and the work that he's put into preparing this course for us. And Lord, you've heard his hopes for this course, and we just pray your blessing on those hopes, that we, through the words that you've given Dave, that we come to know you better and grow deeper with you, and in our love for you and our knowledge of your love for us. And help us to understand these stories, Lord, and the way that we are actors on this stage. Help us to see this picture, and just bless each and every one here. Open their ears to hear what you want to say to each one individually. So we thank you for this time together, and we ask you to bless it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Penny. Now, a confession. There will be some aspects of this that you'll be thinking, why on earth is he telling us this? Why is this useful? But please bear with it. There are some things, such as this first session, that I've called Here Be Monsters. After, on really old maps, where you have these monsters on the edge of the map, usually great sea creatures. It's named after that, and you'll see why in a minute. But sessions like this, you're thinking, what is he going on about here? But some of this stuff is foundational, and you have to sort of slog through some stuff sometimes to understand later on and sort of cash it out. So please bear with it, please go with it, and you might be surprised, maybe even weeks down the line. So as I say, I did film as part of my undergrad degree. So what I want to do to help us to understand the ways in which some of this stuff works in narrative form is use some film terms to help us. So I've called this session the establishing shot. Now, Helen is making more of an impact on this than I am. So this is, oh, hang on, how does that work? Okay, so this is an example of an establishing shot in film. This is from the film Braveheart. And what an establishing shot does is it gives you a big picture of the world that you're entering. It gives the audience an immediate sort of entry point. And what they usually do is sort of sweep over a panorama like this of Scotland, or maybe a city. So many films start with a shot of New York or something like that, usually at night because it looks pretty. And then they zoom in very gradually on the main character. Or as in the case with this, what they might do is tell you where you are and when you are. And the establishing shot is really useful in film. It's a really good shorthand for giving you context. And that is partly what I think that Genesis 1 does in the Bible. It sort of sets the scene for what's to come. So that's why I've called it the establishing shot. And just a quick note on all the sessions. If you want any sort of books or references to look up afterwards that are helpful and that might help you to work through some of this stuff on an even deeper level, I'd be very happy to help you out with that. In fact, I might send an email around with some useful books to read. You don't do email? I'm sorry, Maggie. I'll print some out and bring them next week as well. Sorry, Maggie. Just from the off, a really, really great book for understanding the biblical world as a whole, for understanding the way that they view creation. It's a book called The Biblical Cosmos by Robin Parry, who used to be the editor at Paternoster, I think. Guy lives in Worcester. Really brilliant book. I fully recommend that. So, the creation story that we get in Genesis 1, and I assume that most of you know Genesis 1 roughly. You've read it before? If you haven't, there are Bibles under the seats, so read quickly. The creation story is a formative story in most ancient cultures. Most ancient Near Eastern cultures at least have this, and most cultures around the world have this. Indian cultures have it, Chinese. The Mayan culture, actually, their sacred text, the Popol Vuh, actually sounds very similar to Genesis 1. It's a really interesting read. How nerdy does that sound? Really, yeah, read the Mayan creation story. So even events that aren't sort of literally the creation of the world are often treated as such by a culture. So the Aztecs will treat the creation of the Amazon as their founding creation event. I think it's created by the death of a huge serpent. And what you see this in the Bible as well. So events like the Exodus are given creation language in some of the Psalms, where God is seen to bring creation out of this departure through the Red Sea. And we'll look at that in sort of more detail later on, next week, I think. So Genesis 1 as we have it today, it's probably codified or written in its current form around the time of the Babylonian exile, when Israel goes into exile in Babylon in about 600 BC. There are probably a lot of versions of this story around before that, probably oral versions, some written versions, but we think that the version that we have in its current form comes together around the time of the Babylonian exile. And we have some really good reasons for believing that. And one of the main reasons is the way in which it seems to jar against the Babylonian creation story, called the Enuma Elish. And it's written as what we call a polemic. And a polemic is sort of a parody, kind of a comedy take on something else. And what we think is happening is that the Babylonians have their creation story. And the Israelites are taken into exile in Babylon. And they see this creation story, and they see these statues of the gods, and they hear how the world was meant to be created, and they go, I don't think that's right, actually. Like, that's not what we were taught. That's not the story we heard. And so they write it in a way that deliberately bucks against the Enuma Elish. So in the Enuma Elish, so here's a stele from, I'm not sure where that is actually, but this depicts the Babylonian creation story. So the guy running is a god called Marduk, and he's chasing a chaos monster called Tiamat. And in the Babylonian creation story, what happens is that you have these chaotic primordial waters, out of which Tiamat rises to fight with the gods. And Marduk eventually defeats Tiamat and slays this, it's a demon effectively, or a chaos monster. And, sorry, this is a bit gruesome, but Marduk rips Tiamat in two, and the bottom half of the carcass becomes the earth and the top becomes the sky. And so this separation of the chaos monster forms the world. And then Marduk makes other gods, so like the sun god, the moon god. He kills another chaos monster called Kingu, not Pingu, Kingu with a Q. And from his blood, he creates humanity to be the slaves of the gods. Because the gods have worked hard enough to fight all these chaos monsters, so they create humanity to be slaves so that the gods can rest. Now Genesis 1 is interesting because it bucks against a lot of that. God also creates from separation, but he simply speaks and says, let the earth and the waters separate, and it became the earth and the sky. Humanity is not the slave of the gods. Humanity is God's most precious creation, the pinnacle of creation, and they join in his rest. Moses commands that we have a Sabbath day to commemorate God taking the seventh day off. The sun and the moon, they're not gods in Genesis 1. Actually, it doesn't even call them anything. It just says the greater light and the lesser light. They are dodging it big time. They're like, they are not gods in any way, shape or form. They're just lights that God creates. Right, so can you see how Genesis 1 works as a polemic against this kind of idea? But there's some really interesting points about that, because there are other parts of the Bible where you have creation stories. They're not as big as Genesis 1, but they are there. And you do actually have this language that you get in the Enuma Elish of a god slaying a chaos monster. So here's a few examples. And here's another picture of Marduk. And you can see that he's got the cosmic wheels on his dress. He's wearing a crown because he's royal, gods are royal. And he has the signs of the zodiac on him as well. And underneath him is Tiamat. And he's standing on Tiamat to show that he's conquered the chaos monster. So this is a passage from the book of Job, talking about God. By his power he stills the sea. By his wisdom he cut Rahab, the great sea monster, to pieces. So Rahab is a chaos monster. By his breath the skies became fair. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. So chaos monsters are often serpents or dragons or that kind of thing. Here's another one. This is Psalm 74. You destroyed the sea by your strength. You shattered the heads of the sea monster in the water. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. Leviathan is another name of a chaos monster, like Rahab. Psalm 89. You rule over the proud sea. So you have these primordial chaotic waters that you have in the Babylonian story. When its waves surge, you calm them. You crushed the proud one and killed it. And last one, this is from Isaiah. So we've got a real swathe here, right? So we've got Job, we've got a couple of Psalms, we've got the prophets. Did you not smash the proud one? Did you not wound the sea monster? And you get hints of this elsewhere as well. So in the book of Daniel, Daniel prophesies about beasts coming out of the sea. Well, these are chaos monsters visiting destruction upon the earth. And yes, they're like representative of kings and that kind of thing, but the language is that of sort of primordial creation language of the ancient Near East. You have Jonah, who falls into the chaotic waters and is swallowed by a chaos monster, effectively. You have a really interesting story in one of the Gospels, where Jesus casts a demon out of someone, and he sends it into a herd of pigs, and then sends a herd of pigs off the edge of a cliff into the sea. He sends the chaos back from where it came, back into the sea. He restrains it. And what I always find really interesting is in Revelation 21, where it talks about the new heavens and the new earth. And it says there'll be no more tears and no more weeping. The old things have passed away. There'll be no more sea. Have you ever noticed that? There's no sea. Because chaos has finally been defeated. So this kind of language is scattered all over the Bible. But do we have it at all in Genesis 1? Do we? Why not? I will come back to that. Do we have any of this kind of language at all in Genesis 1? Do we have chaotic waters in Genesis 1?
No, we just have waters.
Just waters. How do we know they're just waters?
There is no sense of chaos.
Okay, there's no sense of chaos. Okay, so let's go to that verse that Nick is talking about. So this is Genesis 1 verse 2. So the earth was formless, it's the word tohu, and void, bohu. So the earth is tohu va bohu. There isn't really an exact translation of it. It's sort of formless and void is pretty good. Wild and waste is another one. It's kind of chaotic, actually. And darkness was over the surface of the watery deep. But the spirit, ruach, which is kind of like the breath of God, was moving, rachaf, over the surface of the water. God said, "Let there be light." So we have chaotic waters, I think, in Genesis 1. But God does not defeat anything that comes out of those waters. He hovers over the water, he moves, and he speaks. This is quite a peaceful conquest, isn't it? If it is a conquest at all. Is there anywhere else that you might have chaotic water or sea beasts or monsters in Genesis 1? Verse 21. David Hughes. Genesis 1:21. God created bara, the great sea creatures, Tananim. Now, barach is a really interesting word to use for that. Barach is used 3 times in Genesis 1. It's used in the very first verse, God created the heavens and the earth. It's used in this verse for the great sea creatures. And it's used for humanity. Bara is God's divine creativity. God created the great sea creatures. And Tananim is the word that gets translated in our Bibles as great sea creatures. But it's the word that's used in Psalm 74 and Isaiah 51 for chaos monsters, for Rahab and Leviathan. So these monsters do exist in Genesis 1. They're just sort of not a problem. And in Genesis 1, God doesn't battle the Tananim, he creates them and he calls them good. And they're described as being divinely created alongside the whole of the cosmos, actually, and humanity. So why does the story of God begin with the traditional antagonists, right, there's another film term, the enemies, the traditional enemies, why are they recast in Genesis 1? as part of the good creation? Were they just misunderstood all along? It's kind of like, and here's a really sort of niche sci-fi reference, it's kind of like taking Darth Vader, this really evil bad guy, and giving him a backstory where he's just this angsty teenager with raging hormones and a phobia of sand, right? A good storyteller just wouldn't do that kind of thing. So what's going on with, I can see that none of you actually like Star Wars, so I'm really sorry. So George Lucas did do that with Darth Vader, and it was an abomination. I'm glad I've got one person agreeing with me. So what is going on? I think there's something really interesting going on, because what you have in the Babylonian story is that the earth is perfect after the gods defeat chaos. Because God has used, or the god, Marduk, has used the carcass of the slain chaos monster to parade his victory, effectively. And he creates humanity out of the blood of Kingu to be his slaves so that they can rest. And this is like a perfect end to the story in the Babylonian mindset. I know it sounds horrific to us. Can you see how the Enuma Elish actually is inextricably linked to the Babylonian culture? Let me explain what I mean. Babylon at that time is the predominant empire in the world. They defeat their enemies and they recreate their lands after the Babylonian fashion. They destroy what doesn't fit with their worldview. And they take their enemies and they kill them. They make them live according to this Babylonian way of life, or they enslave them. And Babylonians deserve slaves because they've conquered them. And the Babylonians deserve rest, so they use other peoples as their slaves. Their creation narrative depicts their gods doing exactly the same thing, but on a cosmic scale. Or perhaps you could say that because they understand this is how their gods created the world, this is how they act towards other people. It's kind of like this vicious cycle, right? Either they write their creation story after the way they act to other people, or they act towards other people because of how they understand their gods act. They conquer, they build empires, and they enslave. The Babylonian creation story makes perfect sense in the context of their culture, which I think might go some way to explaining why Genesis 1 does not look like that. Because you have earlier Israelite texts like Psalm 89 that we read that come from the comfort of being an independent kingdom. They're even a mini empire, actually, Israel at the time. And it's easy, as the Babylonians do in that context, to believe that God has triumphed over evil. But there's a problem when you get taken into exile, when you become slaves yourselves. But does that mean that God failed to conquer chaos? Does that mean that God failed to kill your enemies? That's a bit of a problem when you believe in a perfect deity. So I think that they do something slightly different in Genesis 1. Because they can't talk about God defeating the chaos monsters. Because they can demonstrably see in their own lives in Babylon that that actually is not the case. Their enemies are all around them. So has God failed, or is something different going on? To understand this a bit, I think we have to look at what they say about humanity. So this is God talking. Let's make humankind in our image, so they may rule and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth. We're called to have dominion over the earth and subdue it. That's what humanity's role is. So if chaos is allowed to reign, according to Genesis 1, it's not God's fault, it's ours. He creates the Tananim, he calls them good. The potential chaos brings good balance to the creation. You have the Tananim on one side, you have humanity on the other. And our task is to keep that balance and to to keep the chaos subdued, but there is always the potential for it rising up. And we're asked to sort of multiply and grow the creation. We're called to be fruitful. We're asked to be co-creators with God. We're given great responsibility. We're given great power in sharing in some of the divine action of God. We're not his slaves, like in the Babylonian model. Right? Like I said, we're invited to join in his rest. In fact, Moses commands that we join in his rest. We keep the Sabbath day. But we do have responsibilities. God does give us authority and responsibility, and that is to keep the chaos under control, to keep it subdued and under our feet. It's our responsibility, not God's. It's not God that's failed, according to Genesis 1. It's us. Israel is in exile in Babylon, not because of God, but because they have failed to do what they should have been doing as humanity. So what we'll see in Genesis 2-3, which we'll look at next week, is the way in which that starts to unravel and the way in which that starts to fail. And you might be able to see hints already of that as we talk about chaos monsters and serpents, maybe, and how that works out in the garden with Adam and Eve. What goes wrong? And actually, I kind of think that they might see the Garden of Eden, Israel, as a picture of Israel, and how they fail, and how they get booted out of paradise because of their failure to subdue what they were meant to subdue. So Satan's creation is this balance where the cosmos and everything that exists is this creative act of God. He barachs it. The potential for chaos, the disruptive elements of this creative act of God as well. And we are left as this creative force, given a divine mandate to keep the balance. So we'll reflect on a few things, and then we'll have a drinks break. I'm parched. I can do with a brew. So here's a few questions just to mull over, and then we'll dive back into the second session. We'll have about a 15-minute break, I think, and then dive back in after that. So how does this understanding of chaos and evil affect our actions? How does it affect the way that you act in the world? Is there any chaos in your own heart or life that needs subduing? Because I think that's probably a good place to start. I feel like I always have the potential for chaos building up in me, a destructive sort of bent, a self-destructive bent often. How do I keep that subdued? Before I worry about the rest of the world, about politics and all that stuff, I need to worry about my own heart first. And then maybe we can move on to the world. What do you consider chaotic in the world? What is our responsibility? What do chaos monsters look like nowadays? And how do we subdue them? Stop them from rearing their heads? And a question that I've not actually put on there, but is chaos redeemable? I don't know. I don't know the answers to any of these questions, but just some things to mull over. Shall we have a drinks break? David has very kindly agreed to serve us drinks tonight. I think we're on our own from next week. So I think it'll be self-service next week, but David has agreed to give us some drinks tonight. So he's just serving them out in the lounge. If you need a rest break or... No, it's fine. If anyone needs a rest break, there's some toilets at the back or there's some down in the lobby. And I'll see you at 25 to, is that okay? Helen, during the break, put a picture of this on Facebook, and my wife, who's not here because she's looking after our kids, put a comment on saying, is everyone wearing coats because it's cold or because they're not sure whether they're staying? So, thank you, Rachel. I love you. It's because it's freezing cold, right? Yeah?
They're taking coats off now. We need to take a second photo.
If you guys get hypothermia, please do not blame me. I didn't pressure you into that. So let's go on to session 2 and the image of God. So we're still in Genesis 1. And we've done a little bit on the image of God, on humanity, and on what we're created to be and what we're created to do. But we're going to sort of drill down a little bit more into that and go a bit deeper and go into more detail. And so I've called this one Protagonists, because in films very often what you get is the establishing shot then zooms in on your main characters and shows you them in the context of the wider sort of place. And I think this is what we get with humanity. You sort of get the wide sweep of the whole creation, and then it zooms in on this pinnacle of creation. Everything is good, and then suddenly humanity is very good, and we talk about us. We are the protagonists. We're the ones who drive the story forward. Yeah, so Genesis 1:26 is the sort of key passage for this. So we've already looked at this briefly, but let's look at it in a fair amount of detail. And God said, "Let us make humankind, Adam." So Adam is in Genesis 2 we have Adam and Eve, right? So Adam is actually the word for all of humanity. So in Genesis 1 it's male and female. It's all of humanity. And what you get in Genesis 2 is he creates Adam, and then his wife comes out of him. So Adam is like the whole person, and then it's sort of split up. Does that kind of make sense? In our image, Salem, maybe it doesn't make sense, but that's okay, it's not important. After our likeness, Demut. So the full phrase that we have here is Elohim, Amar, Asar, Adam, Salem, Demut. And we could spend literally a year on those 6 words of Hebrew. We won't. I heard like a disappointed tussing there. Who wanted to spend a whole year on it? So made in the image of God, right, is this phrase that gets passed around Christianity quite a lot. And it's something that I asked on the email I sent out. What do you think it means to be made in the image of God? Has anyone got any ideas?
Well, parts of God's character.
Okay, so to have parts of God's character.
To have free will.
To have free will, as God does.
Well, what about to be alive?
To be alive.
Opposite of a thing.
The opposite of a thing. Is an animal alive?
Oh, yes, it is.
Is it made in the image of God? Actually, does an animal have free will?
Cats.
I think we could, any cat owners, I think that we can all agree cats definitely have free will. Are they made in the image of God? I would say definitively cats are not made in the image of God. Cats definitely believe they are made in the image of God. Yeah. A reflection of God, like a mirror image. Like you're looking at God but it's backwards. Okay, interesting. Okay. Exactly the same. We are God, but backwards. This is my mum, so I can mock her a little bit. Yeah, you're my straight guy. Anyone else?
Icon.
Pardon?
An icon.
An icon? What do you mean by that?
You see through an icon.
Okay. So you see through an icon. So in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, I don't know if you've ever seen these. They have pictures on their walls of saints or of Jesus maybe, and they are pictures that help them to see God or things of God, and there are very specific ways in which they can be painted. So they have to have certain cracks in them so that you know that they're not the actual thing. They're very stylized, and they sort of use that as a way to see through the image, to see something of God or to see God himself. And David's suggesting that humanity works in a similar way.
An icon doesn't only go one way.
Oh, an icon doesn't go one way. Okay.
In the sense that it's also God reaching out through the picture to us.
Okay.
It's a two-way thing.
Okay, so go further with that as to what that means for humanity.
And that means that we are not only people can see God in us, but actually God reaches out through us to others.
Okay, so we do things on behalf of creation to God, and God does things through us for creation, maybe. That's interesting. Yeah. Fred. Yeah.
Someone's going to say something. We can't hear at the back. Can you tell us what?
Yeah. Sorry. I've been trying to repeat things, but I forgot there. So I feel like I summed up what you said. Is that yeah? Did you catch the summing up? Oh right. Okay. So Daniel is suggesting that icons are two-way. They're not just a one-way thing. We don't just look through it to see God. God also works through it to speak to us and to serve the world. So if humanity acts as an icon, then that would mean that creation looks to us for the things of God, and we look to God for things that will benefit creation. Is that fair? That's what you're saying? Okay. An icon's made of wood. It's a fair point. I don't think that actually disproves the theory. Yeah, so a friend of mine, an old lecturer of mine, a guy called Crispin Fletcher-Louis, he says that you should stand up tall because you are the meeting point of heaven and earth. Which is, you should stand up tall and straight because you are the meeting point of heaven and earth. Which I kind of like, and that kind of fits with this kind of icon language. I wasn't going to use icon language, but I think it's a really, really, I was going to say a good picture, but an icon is a picture, whatever. Okay. So the stuff that we get about the character, the rationality, that kind of thing, is possibly true. I'm not going to say that, Jude, you're silly for saying that. It's kind of a Platonic idea. It's a Greek idea. Doesn't mean it's wrong. We don't really see it in Genesis 1, though. Actually, these words that we have here, salem and demut, they're very physical terms. They're visual, they're concrete. And nothing in the context of Genesis 1 suggests that only part of humanity is made in the image of God. It's not just our soul, or our character, or our personality, or our drive, or our motives that are made in the image of God. It's all of us. We are complete beings. All of us is made in the image of God. This is really important to the Hebrew mindset. And I think, in part, this kind of language is a function of the way that ancient Near Eastern people in particular thought about God. They kind of envisaged God as what we might call an anthropomorphized super being, which I'll explain what I mean. Basically, this is how many ancient peoples view the gods, right? They're like us, but more so. Or maybe you could say we're like them, but less so. So we can sort of imagine what they're like. They're just sort of greater and more powerful and more whatever than we are. And this is a little bit what we're getting in Genesis 1. And you particularly get it in like Greek texts, and you get it with Marduk, for instance, in the Babylonian culture, and with the Egyptian gods. They can do other things, like they can change into animals and whatever, but basically they're like us with superpowers. And this is kind of the language that you're getting in Genesis 1, which is problematic, I'll grant you that. Shall I address that? Maybe we'll address that in another week, actually. because it's not so problematic that it's going to trip us up for what we need to go to today. But if you have a serious issue with this sort of depiction of God as this super being, then there are other ways of looking at God. And actually there are other ways in Genesis 2 in particular that God is depicted that add a more sort of complete picture to what he's like. So if that is an issue, we can come back to it, and I'm happy to address that.
So just for clarity, what was the issue we were exploring?
The fact that God is a super being. The fact that he's like us and we can immediately visualize him as just being like us, but more so. That kind of issue. If that's a problem, we can address it. But the point for now is that being made in God's image means that we look like him. All of us look like him. And this has some really serious implications in the ancient world. So if we take Egypt as an example, I imagine most people have like a working knowledge of ancient Egypt. Who is made in the image of the gods in Egypt? Do we know?
Pharaoh.
The Pharaoh. Who's the Pharaoh? So he's basically the king, right? So this is the Pharaoh. Do we know who this is? Tutankhamun. Yep, brilliant. We'll do a bit more on Tutankhamun next week. No, maybe we'll do a little bit more on Incarnation next week, not loads. But Genesis 1 says that we are all made in the image of God. Now in the ancient world this is radical, because most ancient cultures like Egypt say that the king is made in the image of God, and he rules on behalf of the king. In Genesis 1 we are all royal. So let's go further with this, because you might not be convinced just by that sort of, some cultures did this, so that means that Genesis 1 definitely says this. So Exodus 19, so this is God talking to the Israelites when they're in the Sinai desert. You'll be for me a royal priesthood and a holy nation. And we'll deal with the priesthood bit in another week. But for now, let's hear that again. God's people are royal. And maybe this is why we get God's reluctance for Israel to have a king, the same way that the other nations do. Do you remember this story? So in 1 Samuel something, 8 maybe, Israel demands a king, and God reluctantly sort of grants them this king, Saul. But he says that they've rejected him as king over them. But the other reason he's reluctant is that all of Israel is meant to be royal. So God is kind of this king above the kings. So we get this in Deuteronomy 17, rules about if you ever get a king, blah, 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 blah. The king must not exalt himself above his fellow citizens. And this is because they're meant to be equal. And it's not because the king is not better than the commoners. It's because the commoners are not worse than the king. They are all meant to be royal. And God's role as this ultimate king over the kings functions as his sort of ultimate authority. But he sort of delineates this authority to the rest of Israel, but it's meant to be the whole of humanity. Israel only comes into effect because humanity fails, and he has to sort of start again with a very small group of people that is meant to go outwards. Genesis 1 insists that all people, not just Pharaoh, are made in the image of God. They are all royal. And there's more as well. So let's make humankind in our image, after their likeness, they may rule. Radar. So this word, you have it translated in different ways in different Bibles. So it's rule, dominate, subdue. So we mentioned it a little bit in the first part. This is a royal word. This ruling over is royal. So here it is in other places in the Bible, referring to kings. So Solomon had dominion over Radar, the kingdoms west of the Euphrates. May the king have dominion, Radar, from sea to sea, etc. in one of the Psalms. And to hammer home the point, here we have Psalm 8. And I realise I'm rattling through these references, and I'm sorry to people who are trying to take notes. Maggie. I will sort of give you a handout, either by email or I'll print one out. So here's Psalm 8, which is a creation psalm in a lot of ways. And it uses really explicitly royal language for humanity. So it says, you, that's God, have made humanity a little lower than God, Elohim. I mean, some Bibles say the heavenly beings, but Elohim is the word that we have in Genesis 1 for God. We're happy translating it as God in Genesis 1. We should be happy translating it as God in Psalm 8. Humanity is a little lower than God. You crown, that's pretty royal, them with glory, kavod, which is God's glory. This is the word that we use for God's glory in the Bible. And majesty. Majesty is pretty royal. You appoint them to have dominion over the work of your hands. So it's that word dominion. And that last phrase there, you've put all things under his feet. Now do you remember this from the first part, where you had Marduk conquering the chaos monster Tiamat. And where is Tiamat? Under his feet. And Tiamat is wearing a crown. Sorry, Tiamat's not wearing a crown. Marduk is wearing a crown. He's royal, because the gods are royal. Under his feet. Humanity is meant to have all the works of God's hands under his feet. We are royal. This is what subdue and rule over and have dominion means. We are the kings of creation and queens of creation. Oh, I forgot to put that in. So there's Marduk with Tiamat. And it implies really specifically the subduing of chaos and the defeat of chaos monsters. We don't have time to go through it properly, but I might put a comparison in this handout actually, but Psalm 89 is particularly fascinating. Because Psalm 89 has this wonderful description of God in the first half of it. And in this description it talks about God ruling over the raging sea, the chaos. He defeats Rahab, the chaos monster. And in the second half of the psalm, attention turns to David, the king. And David is set over the seas by God. And the implication is that the chaos is under the king's feet. And if we are all royal, then that applies to all of us, not just to David. So royalty as this representative of the divine, which is sort of restricted to privileged individuals or these prestigious bloodlines in other cultures, it's democratized in Genesis 1. This is beautiful. You are royal. You have authority. You take on the responsibilities of the true king, God, and you rule in his stead. What do you call that? Is that like a regent or something? I'm not sure what you'd... I probably shouldn't have gone into like medieval sort of monarchy language. I have no idea what... I'm out of my depth in that. And it's also incarnational language. We call this incarnation. We are incarnated in the world as kings and queens on God's behalf. And there's another layer to this language that we get in Genesis 1 as well. So if we go back to this, so we have Adam, Selem, Demut. So this word Selem, this word used that we translate image. Let's look at a couple of other places in the Old Testament where this word is used and see if we can work out, without cheating, how it might be translated. So here's the first example. All the people went and demolished the temple of Baal, who's a Canaanite god. They smashed its altars and Selem. And second example, you'll pick up your Selem of Sekuth, your king, and Kiun, your star god, which you made for yourselves. What could Selem mean in those verses? How do we think it might be translated? Statue, okay, yeah. Image. Is it translated exactly the same as in Genesis 1? Icon. He's obsessed. Pardon? Idol. Yeah. I think if you look up those verses in most Bibles, they would be translated idol. Or maybe images. But the images that are specifically referring to statues, or maybe images on a wall or something. Usually statues. And it's really interesting, there's a phrase in ancient Akkadian that's this, they're a near neighbour of Israel. And it looks something like this when it's been sort of transliterated. And it's this phrase, Salam Elam Ilani. And it means image of the gods. And this is the word that the Akkadians used for their idols. And it looks very similar to this phrase that's sort of hinted at in Genesis 1. Salem Elohim, image of God. It's very, very similar. In fact, actually, you could probably translate Genesis 1:26 like this. Then God said, let us make humanity to be our idol. I mean, why not? You could use that same language. If you're willing to translate Salem as idol elsewhere in the Old Testament, why are you not willing to do it in Genesis 1? And that sounds weird to us, right? What does it mean? What does that mean, that we are the idol of God? Does anyone recognise this idol? Does anyone know what this? Donald Trump.
I'm too handsome for that.
Orange enough. No? Okay, I'll give you another picture of the same idol. There it is. This is. It's not a real god. It's the idol that Indiana Jones steals. It's like I think it's meant to be like a fertility idol or something that he steals in Raiders of the Lost Ark. But this idol is. What do we imagine that idols are? What do we think they do? What do ancient people think they are? I'm hearing a lot of whispers.
They stand in place of the God that they worship.
They stand in place of the God that they worship. Okay. They represent the God that the people worship. Yeah, that's really important because it's not a God. They don't worship the idol as a God. They know it's not, right? They understand this. They're not completely balmy. It's an object. They know it's an object, but it's more than an object to them. It's this special kind of object that's sort of suspended somewhere between heaven and earth. It's an object that's been given life and power by the God. Which sounds odd to us, right? So it's this object made of wood or metal or stone, and it's made to look like the God that it represents. And it's then imbued with the life of that God. And the Egyptian culture is a really good example again of how this kind of thing happens. So what they'd do is they'd craft their idol, and they'd sort of perform what they call an opening of the mouth ceremony, where they... Lindsay's sniggering. Where the idol would be ritually brought to life. So what would happen is the priest, and I think it's probably this guy on the left, would enact the mouth being open so that the idol could breathe and so that it could eat. And the idol is given life by the God. It represents the God in the temple. It's its physical presence on the earth and in that particular place. And so when a worshipper bowed before the idol, they believe they're bowing in the presence of the God, but they're not bowing to the idol. Does that kind of make sense? It's a really important distinction. It's the image of the God, which acts as the presence of the God, but it only has value because of what the God has granted it. Or I suppose, like, if you want to take it a step further, because those gods don't exist, it has value because of what the people have invested in it. And this is a really important thing to understand for later on, and particularly for what happens in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. Objects sometimes have power because of what we invest in them, because of our expectations of them, because we project things onto them. That sports car, does it have any particular power on its own? Not really, but because you invested your hopes and your dreams in it, because you think that it'll get you more women, or because you think it'll give you more prestige, suddenly it has more status than it's only a hunk of metal. Or your job, maybe, a more abstract thing, but it's still something that we can project our hopes and expectations onto. Or even our fears, we can project fears onto things as well, and they become idols in that way. So remember that kind of idea for later on. It's going to be important for what happens in the Garden of Eden. So an idol isn't a false god. That's important. It is the image of a false god, though. Which begs the question, why do Israel not have any idols? Because they have a true God, and what's wrong with making an image of him? Well, the answer I think that we've come up with is that he's already made his image. Us. They're not, the Ten Commandments specifically says you are not to make an image of God. In the temple in Jerusalem, in the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant is there, described as God's footstool. You have the cherubim, sort of two large cherubim, and cherubim are kind of like, they're not like little sort of flappy little angel child things. They're really majestic beasts with huge wings, and there's two of them, and they stand tip to tip with their wings across the Holy of Holies, and it forms the throne of God. But there is no idol sitting on the throne. It's empty. They're not allowed to make idols of God because he's already made humanity. Naomi?
So we are God's idols?
Yes. And we'll sort of dig into what that means. I know it makes you feel awkward, right? Like it's a squirmy sort of idea. Let's use this translation for a second just to help us. Let us make humanity to be our idol. We're to be a representation of him, to be his physical presence in the world. We are not God. That is important. We are a representation of God, given life by God. We're not to be worshipped for who we are. Again, very important. But I do think that the original intention was for the rest of creation to look to us as the perfect image of God and be awestruck by how beautiful we are because we reflect his glory, his kavod. That's what humanity is created to be. And we see this in the Garden of Eden story when Adam is created. It's a really fascinating description of how Adam is created. It says that God crafts him from the dirt, from the ground. He molds him. It's almost like an idol is being crafted. And then he breathes into his mouth the breath of the divine life. It sounds very much like the Egyptian opening of the mouth ceremony. That's how it's written. And it's written like that deliberately. And what happens in the Egyptian culture is when they've sort of performed this ceremony, they leave food out for the idol, for it to eat. And then someone comes and sneakily clears it away in the night so it looks like the idol's eaten it. And we see in Genesis 2 that God plants an orchard around the person that he's created for him to eat. But unlike the lifeless idols of other nations, Adam walks and talks and moves around and actually does eat and has free will as well, which is amazing. He's this amazing mix of divinity and dust. As other nations believe that idols sat somewhere between heaven and earth, so Adam in Genesis 2 literally does. He's crafted from the dirt, but he's imbued with the breath of God, as nothing else in creation is. He's spirit, but he's also soil. He's unique among the creation. And he's the one to whom the rest of creation looks to as the physical presence of God on earth. And just as the idols of other nations are placed in a temple, so Adam was placed in a garden. And the garden acts almost like a temple, where the glory of God is meant to radiate out to the world. And we'll look at that a little bit more in another week. But you have these, Angus mentioned the rivers that flow out of Eden. And it's really important that they flow out of Eden to bless the earth. It sends good things out of the garden. And you have this amazing vision in the book of Ezekiel with these rivers that flow out from under the temple. It's the same kind of image. Or the river of life in the book of Revelation that flows out from the city of God to bless the rest of the world. So the very cosmos is created for God's glory. And you might not feel it, but you are the pinnacle of what he's made. You are the pinnacle of what he's made. You've been given the responsibility and the joy of nurturing creation, of keeping it in check, of subduing it, of helping it to flourish. And you are royal. You're crowned with glory and honour and majesty by the King of Kings. You are divinity and dust, spirit and soil. You are. You're the image of the living God. You are his idol, bearing his presence on earth. What does that mean to you? How do you respond to something like that? So, I don't know how we respond to something like that, but we're going to try with a bit of worship and a bit of prayer. So if you'd like someone to pray with you, maybe just raise a hand, and someone around you will pray for you. If you don't want prayer, look around, and we're a royal priesthood, right? We can all minister. We don't have a prayer ministry team tonight, but we can all minister. We can all pray for each other. So when you're ready to go, just go. And with Tim and Kate, we actually have live worship for the end of this, which is brilliant. So thanks for doing this, guys. I really appreciate it. They'll play a few songs, and there won't be a set end. I'm not going to come up and announce anything else. Feel free to sing, feel free to pray, feel free to be prayed for, feel free to just sit there, feel free to just get up and walk out, and leave when you would like to. And I'll hang around, and if you want to talk to me, you can do. Thanks.